Tonight we journey to a threshold, the moment when human beings first possessed the power to unmake cities in an instant, when the fire of stars was brought to earth and released in terrible bloom. The summer of 1945, the closing months of history's most devastating war. A decision that would shape everything that followed, that would cast its shadow across decades not yet imagined, that would transform the very meaning of what humans could do to one another. This is not a simple story, not a tale of clear righteousness on one side and clear wickedness on the other. The decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki emerged from a web of circumstances so tangled that even those who made the choice could not see all its threads. Years of global war had exhausted nations and numbed consciences. Millions had already died, in trenches and on beaches, in firebombed cities and in death camps, in Pacific islands and in European forests. The mathematics of destruction had grown so vast that another 100,000 deaths could seem like mercy if it ended the killing sooner. We will explore not to condemn or absolve, but to understand, to feel the weight of what those summer days held, to honor the dead on all sides, the American soldiers who feared invasion, the Japanese civilians who woke to ordinary mornings that would become anything but ordinary, the scientists who built what they could not unbuild, the leader who gave the order and carried it for the rest of his days. We will sit with the questions that have no final answers, that each generation must ask anew, that remain as urgent now as they were when the first mushroom cloud rose over the New Mexico desert. The story begins with a man who did not seek power, but found it thrust upon him. A farmer's son from Missouri, who had known failure and persistence, who had walked behind mules and balanced account books, who had served in the First World War and understood something of what combat asked of men. Harry Truman became president 12 days before learning the secret that would define his legacy: the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb, the choice that waited for him like a door that could never be closed once opened. We will follow that choice through its making and its consequences, through the secret laboratories where physicists unlocked matter's deepest secrets, through the desert test that proved the weapon worked, through the strategic calculations that weighed lives against lives in arithmetic no human should have to perform, through the morning when Hiroshima ceased to exist as it had been, through the aftermath that continues still, in memorial parks and in missile silos, in the questions we ask and the answers we cannot find. Tonight, we move slowly through this history. We'll not rush. We'll allow the weight to settle naturally. We'll permit complexity without demanding resolution. The night is long. The story is heavy. Let us carry it together, gently, as we would carry anything sacred and terrible, with reverence for what was lost, with humility before what we cannot fully understand, with awareness that we too live in the shadow of that summer, in a world still shaped by choices made when thunder learned its name. Now, let us enter the story of Harry Truman and the decision that changed everything. Let us begin with a man who never expected to hold such power. Standing suddenly at the center of forces he had not imagined, carrying a burden no human had ever carried before. In the spring of 1945, a man who had once walked behind mules through Missouri soil found himself holding the weight of a secret that could end worlds. Harry S. Truman had not sought the presidency, had not campaigned for the vice presidency with ambition's hungry intensity, had accepted the position reluctantly when party leaders insisted, had spent his brief time in the role attending few meetings of consequence, learning little of what truly occupied the highest levels of wartime government. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that towering figure who had guided America through depression and war, kept his own counsel on the greatest secrets. And so when Roosevelt died on April the 12th, 1945, the man who inherited the presidency inherited also a vast unknowing. The early years tell their own story. Born in 1884 in Lamar, Missouri, Harry Truman grew up knowing the rhythms of rural life, the way seasons turned and crops demanded patience, the way a farmer's success depended on forces beyond human control: weather, markets, the simple luck of rain falling when rain was needed. His father speculated in grain futures and lost everything when Harry was young, teaching the boy early that fortune could reverse without warning, that security was never certain, that one must persist through failure, because failure was simply part of living. The young Truman worked at various jobs: bank clerk, railroad timekeeper, farmer on his grandmother's land. He wore thick glasses that disqualified him from military academies, though he memorized the eye chart to enlist when the Great War came, serving as captain of an artillery battery in France, leading men through the Meuse-Argonne offensive, discovering in himself a capacity for leadership he had not suspected. The war marked him as it marked all who survived it: the mood and the shells, the friends who did not return, the knowledge of what violence truly meant when stripped of abstraction. After the war came the haberdashery, a men's clothing store in Kansas City, opened with an army friend, failed within 2 years when the post-war recession arrived. The failure haunted Truman, who refused bankruptcy, who spent years paying off creditors, who understood intimately what it meant to work and lose, to invest hope and have hope denied. The experience might have embittered him. Instead, it seemed to deepen something: a sympathy for ordinary people facing ordinary struggle, a suspicion of those who achieved success too easily, a determination to persist despite setback. Politics offered another path. Tom Pendergast, the Kansas City political boss whose machine controlled local democratic politics, saw something useful in the honest veteran and helped him win election as county judge, an administrative rather than judicial position, overseeing roads and public works. Truman proved capable, even excellent. building roads and infrastructure while maintaining personal integrity, unusual in machine politics, earning a reputation for efficiency and honesty that coexisted uneasily with his association with Pendergast's sometimes corrupt organization. The Senate came next. Election in 1934, re-election in 1940, years spent in relative obscurity. A loyal New Dealer who supported Roosevelt's programs without attracting national attention. Truman chaired a committee investigating waste in military spending during the war, saving billions through careful oversight, earning respect without headlines. He was known as dependable, hard-working, unpretentious, qualities that made him acceptable to various factions when Roosevelt needed a new running mate in 1944, when the president's declining health made the vice presidential nomination a matter of genuine consequence. But Roosevelt kept Truman at arm's length, rarely met with him, never briefed him on the war's most sensitive matters. The new vice president attended a few cabinet meetings, presided over the Senate as the Constitution required, waited in an outer room of power without access to its inner chambers. He did not know that thousands of scientists labored in secret cities across America, working to unlock the energy within atoms. Did not know that billions of dollars had been spent on a project so classified that even most members of Congress remained ignorant. Did not know that the greatest decision of the century would soon be his to make. And then Roosevelt was gone. Truman was summoned to the White House on that April evening, was told by Eleanor Roosevelt that the president had died, responded with the only words he could find, "Is there anything I can do for you?" The widow's answer carried weight he could not yet understand. "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." The briefings began. Secretary of War Henry Stimson requested a meeting to discuss a matter of utmost secrecy. On April 25th, 2 weeks into his presidency, Truman learned of the Manhattan Project, the vast enterprise that had consumed resources and genius for nearly 3 years, that had created something unprecedented that now approached completion. Stimson's words were careful, weighty. Within 4 months, they would likely have the most terrible weapon ever known in human history, one bomb of which could destroy a whole city. We pause here, in this moment of revelation, feeling what Truman must have felt. The ground shifting beneath his feet, the world revealing depths he had not imagined, the burden settling onto shoulders that had not expected to bear such weight. The farmer's son from Missouri, the failed haberdasher, the machine politician who had maintained his honesty, the artillery captain who knew what war demanded. All of his life had prepared him for difficulty, for persistence, for carrying on when carrying on seemed impossible. But nothing had prepared him for this. The night deepened around the White House. The war continued in Europe and in the Pacific. The secret project approached its culmination. And Harry Truman, who had walked behind mules, who had balanced account books in a failing store, who had built roads through Missouri countryside, who had investigated military contracts with patient thoroughness. This man now held a choice that would echo through centuries, that would define what human beings were capable of, that would cast its shadow across all the years that followed. The thunder had been placed in his hands. The choice of where it would fall awaited him. The farmer who inherited thunder, standing at the threshold of a new age, carrying a burden no human had ever carried before. The night around him, the decision before him, the world waiting to be transformed by what he chose. Across the American landscape, in places deliberately forgotten by maps, cities rose from nothing and filled with purpose. Oak Ridge in Tennessee, carved from rural farmland, growing to a population of 75,000 within 2 years, a city that consumed more electricity than New York City, whose workers processed uranium through methods they did not understand, whose very existence remained hidden from the nation it served. Hanford in Washington, sprawling across the desert along the Columbia River, producing plutonium through reactors whose function remained mysterious to most who operated them. And Los Alamos, perched on a New Mexico mesa, where a boys' school had once stood, where the greatest concentration of scientific genius in human history gathered to solve problems that had never before been posed. The secrecy was absolute, was strange, was a kind of social experiment in how much people would accept without knowing why. Workers at Oak Ridge lived in prefabricated houses that appeared overnight, shopped at company stores, sent their children to hastily constructed schools, and asked no questions about the massive industrial facilities where they worked. The unofficial motto was, "What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here." Signs throughout the facilities reminded workers that loose talk cost lives, that the enemy listened always, that silence was patriotic duty. The separation between knowledge and labor was maintained with almost mystical precision. A worker might spend years operating a machine without understanding its purpose, might contribute essential steps in a process whose end product remained forever unknown to her. The compartmentalization served security. If no one knew the whole, no one could reveal the whole. But it also created strange dislocations, a sense of participating in something vast and hidden, something whose shape could only be guessed at through fragments and implications. At Los Alamos, the atmosphere was different. Here the scientists knew what they were building, knew what it would do, knew the theoretical principles that made atomic fission possible and the engineering challenges that made an actual weapon so difficult. J. Robert Oppenheimer directed the laboratory, a physicist of remarkable breadth, whose knowledge ranged from Sanskrit poetry to quantum mechanics, whose intensity and charisma drew other brilliant minds to the mesa, whose internal conflicts about the weapon he was building would mark him for the rest of his life. The scientists who gathered there included many of the greatest minds of the century. Enrico Fermi, who had achieved the first controlled nuclear chain reaction in a squash court beneath the University of Chicago's football stadium. Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist whose model of the atom had revolutionized physics, who had escaped occupied Denmark by fishing boat, and then by British bomber, whose presence at Los Alamos lent the project almost mythic significance. Hans Bethe, Edward Teller, Richard Feynman, dozens of others whose names would fill textbooks in decades to come, all gathered on a remote mesa, working at the edge of human knowledge, racing against time and against the fear that Germany might achieve the weapon first. That fear of a Nazi atomic bomb had driven the project's inception. In 1939, Albert Einstein had signed a letter to President Roosevelt warning that recent advances in physics made atomic weapons theoretically possible, that Germany might be pursuing such weapons, that America must not fall behind. The letter initiated what would become the Manhattan Project, though years of development and billions of dollars would be required before the theoretical possibility became practical reality. By 1945, Germany had been defeated, its atomic program revealed as far less advanced than feared. But the momentum continued. The weapon would be completed. The only question was how it would be used. Life at Los Alamos was strange amalgam of frontier outpost and academic seminar. Scientists lived in rustic cabins and apartment buildings, their mail censored, their movements restricted, their identities concealed behind code names and numbered addresses. Yet the intellectual atmosphere crackled with the energy of great minds working on great problems, of seminars where the world's leading physicists debated implosion dynamics and critical mass calculations, of a community united by purpose, even as that purpose troubled many who served it. The wives and families brought their own perspectives. Children played in the pine forest surrounding the laboratory, unaware of what their parents built. Wives organized social events and managed households in conditions that ranged from adequate to primitive, forming community through shared experience, even as they were forbidden to know what consumed their husbands' days and nights. Some sensed the weight their spouses carried. The late nights, the distracted silences, the way certain topics could never be discussed, without ever being told directly what caused it. And beneath the social routines, the work continued. Problems that had seemed impossible were solved through brilliance and persistence. The implosion design that would make a plutonium bomb practical emerged from calculations and experiments that pushed the boundaries of physics and engineering. The triggering mechanisms, the explosive lenses, the initiator that would start the chain reaction at precisely the right moment. Each challenge was met, each obstacle overcome, the weapon taking shape through the collective effort of thousands of minds and hands. As spring turned to summer in 1945, the work approached completion. The test was scheduled for July in the New Mexico desert, in a place called Trinity, a name Oppenheimer chose, perhaps recalling John Donne's poetry, perhaps sensing that something sacred and terrible was about to be born. The device was assembled, transported to the test site, raised on a steel tower above the desert floor. The scientists who had created it gathered in bunkers and observation posts, waiting to learn whether their calculations were correct, whether the weapon would work, whether they had truly unlocked the power that burned at the center of stars. The secret cities had done their work. Oak Ridge had provided the uranium. Hanford had produced the plutonium. Los Alamos had designed the weapon. Thousands of workers who never knew what they built had contributed their labor to something unprecedented. And now, in the pre-dawn darkness of July 16th, 1945, the culmination approached. The desert waited. The scientists watched. The weapon that would change everything sat atop its tower, silent, patient, ready to reveal what human beings had wrought from the secrets hidden within matter itself. The stars that had forged in secret cities were about to be tested. The fire that had never burned on Earth was about to be released. The boundary between possible and impossible was about to shift. And in Washington, Harry Truman waited for word of whether the weapon worked, whether the choice he faced was real, whether the thunder his scientists had forged would prove true. July 16th, 1945. Before dawn, in a place the Spanish conquistadors had named Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man. A landscape of scrub and sand, an ancient silence, waited for what was coming. The scientists had gathered through the night, dispersed to observation posts at various distances from ground zero, carrying with them the accumulated tension of years of work, the uncertainty of whether their calculations would prove correct, the knowledge that something unprecedented was about to occur. Some had wagered on the yield, how many tons of TNT equivalent the explosion would produce. Some had privately worried that the chain reaction might not stop, might ignite the atmosphere itself, might end everything. The worry had been calculated away, dismissed as extremely unlikely, but in the darkness before the test, certainties seemed less certain. The device sat atop 100-foot steel tower, a sphere of carefully machined plutonium surrounded by precisely shaped explosive lenses, wired to detonators that would fire in microsecond synchronization, compressing the plutonium core to critical density, initiating the chain reaction that would release the energy bound within atomic nuclei. The design was called Fat Man, the implosion weapon, more complex than the uranium gun-type design that would be used at Hiroshima, requiring this test to confirm that the intricate engineering actually worked. The scientists had done everything theory and experimentation could do. Now reality would render its verdict. At 5:29 in the morning, the countdown reached 0. What followed exceeded every expectation. A flash of light, brighter than any sun, brighter than anything human eyes had ever witnessed, illuminated the desert and the mountains and the sky itself with an intensity that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Those who had been instructed to turn away saw the light through their closed eyelids, through the backs of their heads, felt it more than saw it as the world turned white. Those who watched directly through welding goggles saw a fireball forming, rising, expanding, a sphere of incandescent violence that seemed to be creating itself from nothing, that pushed against the darkness with a light that did not belong on Earth. The heat reached the observation posts before the sound, warming faces from miles away, carrying with it the thermal signature of something stellar, something that had previously existed only in the cores of stars. Then the blast wave arrived, a roar that rolled across the desert like the voice of something ancient and terrible awakening, shaking the ground, rattling the bunkers, confirming through physical sensation what the light had already announced. The weapon worked. The weapon worked beyond all but the most optimistic projections. The weapon worked in a way that changed everything. The fireball rose, pulling dust and debris upward, forming the shape that would become the century's most recognizable and most terrible image. The mushroom cloud, climbing into the morning sky, a column of destruction reaching toward the heavens, as if to announce what humanity had done to the cosmos that had created it. The cloud rose to 40,000 feet, its top spreading, its stem boiling with the violence of its birth, a monument to human ingenuity and human capacity for destruction that stood visible for hundreds of miles in every direction. In the aftermath, the scientists emerged from their bunkers and observation posts, moving through a landscape transformed. Where the tower had stood, a crater of fused glass remained. The desert sand melted by the heat into a substance that would be named trinitite, a green glassy material that had never existed before, that existed now only because human beings had brought stellar fire to Earth. The crater was slight, shallower than expected. The energy had gone upward and outward more than downward, but its existence testified to temperatures that exceeded the surface of the sun, to forces that had remade the Earth itself in the instant of their release. Oppenheimer's words, spoken or remembered in those hours, would echo through history. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. The line came from the Bhagavad Gita, from the moment when the god Vishnu reveals his true cosmic form to the warrior Arjuna, and its appropriation by a 20th century physicist in the New Mexico desert carried meanings that Oppenheimer himself perhaps did not fully grasp. He had become something, had helped create something that transcended ordinary human categories. The weapon was not merely powerful, it was a threshold crossed, a boundary dissolved, a door opened that could never be closed. Kenneth Bainbridge, the physicist who had directed the test, offered a different assessment, simpler and perhaps more honest. Now we are all sons of bitches. The words carried their own truth, a recognition that something had been done that could not be undone, that those who had done it bore responsibility regardless of the justifications, that the achievement was also a loss of something, an innocence perhaps, a limit that had seemed fixed and now was gone. The message to Truman, encoded and sent to Potsdam where the president was meeting with Churchill and Stalin, was carefully worded. Operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations. The medical language disguised the reality while confirming what Truman needed to know. The device worked. The power was real. The choice now confronting him was not theoretical but practical. He could authorize the use of atomic weapons against Japan. The question was no longer whether such weapons were possible. The question was whether they should be used. In the days that followed the test, the scientists grappled with what they had done. Some felt elation. The problem had been solved. The years of work vindicated. The engineering and physics proven correct. Some felt relief that the weapon existed, that it might end the war, that its terrible power might save lives by making invasion unnecessary. But many felt something darker, a weight that settled and did not lift, a recognition that they had participated in creating something that changed what humanity was capable of, that made possible horrors previously unimaginable, that would cast its shadow across every day that followed. Leo Szilard, the physicist who had originally drafted the letter Einstein signed to Roosevelt, who had been instrumental in initiating the atomic project, now circulated a petition urging that Japan be given warning before the bomb was used, that demonstration rather than destruction be attempted first. Other scientists joined the petition or expressed similar reservations, but the momentum was too great, the decision-making too remote from the laboratories where the weapon had been built. The scientists had created the weapon. The choice of how to use it rested elsewhere. The flash that turned sand to glass had done its work, had proven the physics, had demonstrated the engineering, had shown that human beings could wield the power that lit the stars. And now that power awaited deployment. The test was complete. The weapon was ready. The cities that would receive it did not yet know they had been chosen, were going about their lives in the summer heat, were living the ordinary days that remained to them before the extraordinary arrived to unmake everything they knew. The sand that had become glass cooled in the desert. The mushroom cloud dispersed in the upper atmosphere. The scientists returned to their laboratories, some to celebrate, some to mourn, all to wait. The threshold had been crossed. The door had been opened, and through it, the future came rushing toward a world not yet ready to receive it. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific War had become a procession of islands, each more costly than the last, each teaching the same terrible lesson. Japan would not yield easily, would not surrender without being made to surrender, would fight with an intensity that defied Western assumptions about the relationship between rational self-interest and military conduct. The names accumulated like stations of a cross. Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each associated with specific horrors, specific costs, specific revelations about what awaited any force that attempted to invade the Japanese homeland itself. Iwo Jima, that volcanic island, barely 8 square miles in area, had cost nearly 7,000 American dead and 20,000 wounded over 36 days of combat in February and March 1945. The Japanese had fortified the island with tunnels and bunkers, had fought from positions that artillery and naval bombardment could not destroy, had resisted until virtually all 21,000 defenders were dead. The famous photograph of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi captured a moment of triumph. But the battle continued for weeks after the photo was taken, the island secured only through the systematic destruction of an enemy who refused to be defeated by any means short of annihilation. Okinawa proved worse. The battle lasted from April through June 1945, claimed more than 12,000 American dead and 36,000 wounded, killed perhaps 100,000 Japanese soldiers, and a similar number of Okinawan civilians. The civilians had been told that Americans were monsters who would rape and murder them. Many threw themselves from cliffs rather than be captured, mothers taking their children with them, entire families choosing death together over surrender to an enemy they had been taught to fear beyond reason. The kamikaze attacks intensified during the battle. Aircraft deliberately crashed into American ships, their pilots accepting certain death to inflict damage on the enemy, a tactic that seemed insane by Western standards, but that reflected a cultural framework in which death in service to the emperor carried meaning that transcended individual survival. The pattern was unmistakable to American military planners. Each step closer to Japan brought more intense resistance, higher casualties, greater willingness to die rather than surrender. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, would begin with Operation Olympic, the assault on Kyushu scheduled for November 1945, to be followed by Operation Coronet, the invasion of the Tokyo plain scheduled for March 1946. The casualty estimates varied depending on assumptions, but none were comforting. Some projections suggested several 100,000 American casualties for Olympic alone. Others projected casualties in the millions if both operations proved necessary, and if Japanese resistance continued at the level seen on Okinawa. The Japanese military, meanwhile, prepared for what they called Ketsugo, the decisive battle for the homeland. They had correctly anticipated that Kyushu would be the first target, had concentrated forces there, had built coastal defenses, and prepared kamikaze aircraft and suicide boats, had organized civilian militias, armed with bamboo spears and improvised weapons, had made clear through every communication that the nation would resist invasion with everything it possessed. The concept of 100 million hearts beating as one expressed the official expectation that the entire population would participate in defense, that surrender was unthinkable, that death in battle was preferable to the shame of defeat. Truman and his advisors faced these realities in their deliberations. The war had already claimed hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of lives overall. Every day it continued meant more death in continued bombing of Japanese cities, in submarine warfare that was strangling Japanese supply lines, in fighting across the Pacific, and in Asia, where Japanese forces still occupied vast territories. The calculus was brutal. If the atomic bomb could end the war quickly, it might save more lives than it cost, might spare both American soldiers and Japanese civilians from the carnage of invasion and prolonged blockade. But the calculus was never simple. There were those who believed Japan was already defeated, that the naval blockade and conventional bombing were sufficient, that surrender might come without invasion if the Allies modified their demand for unconditional surrender to preserve the Emperor's position. There were those who believed demonstration of the bomb on an uninhabited area or announced in advance to allow observation might achieve the same shock effect without killing civilians. There were those who believed the Soviet entry into the war, which was imminent, might prove decisive in itself, that Stalin's declaration of war would convince Japan that continued resistance was truly hopeless. These alternatives were considered, but not adopted. The momentum of the project, the urgency of ending the war, the uncertainty about whether alternatives would actually work, the desire to demonstrate the weapon's power to the Soviets as well as to the Japanese. All these factors combined to maintain the course toward actual use. The target committee had selected cities carefully. They needed to be significant militarily or industrially, large enough to demonstrate the bomb's destructive power, relatively undamaged by previous bombing, so that the atomic weapon's effects could be accurately assessed. Hiroshima emerged as the primary target, Nagasaki as a backup. The orders were issued, the preparations made. The B-29 crews who would fly the missions were briefed on the unusual nature of their cargo, without being told exactly what it was. The weapon was transported to Tinian Island in the Marianas, was assembled in a guarded facility, was loaded into the bomb bay of a B-29 named Enola Gay after the pilot's mother. The war continued. The Japanese leadership debated among themselves, some seeking peace, others refusing to consider surrender. The days passed. The target cities waited. The summer heat lay heavy over Japan, and the ordinary rhythms of life continued in places that had been marked for destruction, but did not know it. The fortress that would not fall. the nation that would not surrender, the invasion that might cost millions of lives, the weapon that offered another path, terrible beyond imagination, but perhaps less terrible than the alternatives. This was the context. This was the weight that pressed down on every decision. This was the impossible arithmetic that Truman and his advisors performed, weighing lives that would be lost against lives that might be saved, making calculations that no human should have to make, choosing between horrors in a world where every choice seemed to lead toward darkness. The island of fire that was Japan, the fortress of will that its defenders had built, the question of how to bring it down without drowning both sides in blood, the atomic bomb as answer, as question, as threshold that once crossed would transform everything that followed. The summer of 1945, the decision approaching, the weight of it settling like stone. Hiroshima in early August 1945 was a city of bridges and rivers, of streetcars and schoolchildren, of summer heat and morning routines. The war had touched it lightly compared to other Japanese cities. No major firebombing raids had fallen on its neighborhoods. No conflagrations had consumed its wooden buildings as they had consumed so much of Tokyo and Osaka and Nagoya. Some residents wondered about this good fortune, speculated about why Hiroshima had been spared. Perhaps the Americans had relatives there, some suggested. Perhaps the city held no military value. Perhaps their luck would simply hold until the war ended. However it ended, and they could return to the lives they had known before everything changed. The city held approximately 350,000 people that summer. Soldiers and sailors stationed at the military headquarters, workers in the factories producing military supplies, women and children evacuated from other cities, families going about the business of living in a nation at war. The Ota River and its tributaries divided the city into islands connected by bridges, the water shimmering in summer light, the willow trees along the banks offering shade from the August heat. The atomic bomb dome, then known as the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, stood near the center of the city. A Western-style building with its distinctive green dome, a landmark that would become something else entirely when this day ended. On the morning of August 6th, the routines began. Streetcars started their routes through the city, collecting workers heading to factories and offices. Schoolchildren walked to school, many of them mobilized for labor duties, clearing fire breaks in case the city's luck finally ran out and the bombers came. Housewives prepared breakfast, swept floors, tended to the tasks that kept households running, even in wartime. A few people looked up at the beautiful clear sky, grateful for the good weather, unaware that the very clarity of the morning was the reason their city had been selected as the target that day, that the bombers required visual conditions for accurate delivery of their weapon. An air raid alert had sounded earlier. A weather reconnaissance plane had passed over, but it had been lifted when the plane departed. False alarms were common by this point in the war, and people had learned to continue their routines unless the actual bombers appeared. The all-clear signal allowed the city to relax, allowed people to emerge from shelters and resume their mornings, allowed the ordinary to reassert itself in the brief interval before the extraordinary arrived. In the hospitals, doctors and nurses prepared for another day of treating the sick and wounded. In the schools, teachers organized their students for the day's work. In the military headquarters, officers reviewed reports and issued orders. In the homes, mothers fed their children and prepared them for the day. In the streetcars, passengers stood holding straps, bodies pressed together in the crowded cars, complaining perhaps about the heat, thinking about the work ahead, or the evening meal to come, or the letters from loved ones serving at the front, each carrying a universe of memory and hope and relationship, each bound to others in the web of affection and obligation that makes human life meaningful, each unaware that less than an hour remained before their city ceased to exist as they knew it. The Enola Gay flew at 31,000 feet, visible from the ground as a tiny silver cross against the blue, unremarkable among the aircraft that had flown over Hiroshima in recent months. 3 B-29s, fewer than the massive formations that had firebombed other cities, seemed to pose little threat. The air raid sirens did not sound again. The anti-aircraft batteries did not fire. The city continued its morning, continued living, continued breathing in the last minutes before breath itself became fire. Aboard the aircraft, the crew performed their duties with professional competence. The bombardier, Thomas Forraby, watched the city approaching through his bomb sight. The target was the WWII bridge. Its distinctive T-shape made it easily identifiable, made it perfect aiming point. At 8:15 local time, the bomb bay doors opened. The weapon, called Little Boy, dropped away from the aircraft. The plane banked sharply, turning to escape the blast that was coming. 43 seconds remained. The bomb fell. The city lived. The gap between them closed. In those 43 seconds, the ordinary continued. A streetcar completed its stop and began to move again. A mother finished braiding her daughter's hair. A doctor entered a patient's room. A teacher called a class to order. A worker arrived at the factory gate. Each second passed. Each second was a lifetime of small actions and unconscious thoughts, of bodies moving through familiar routines, of minds occupied with immediate concerns that would never need to be resolved. 43 seconds. 42. 41. The bomb fell. The city waited. The gap closed. And then, at 8:16 in the morning, time itself seemed to rupture. The bomb detonated 600 meters above the city, and everything that had been became what it would forever after be. The city that knew the atomic bomb. The city that bore witness to what human beings could do to human beings. The city whose name would become a word that meant something beyond itself. A word that would echo through all the decades that followed, carrying with it the weight of all the mornings that ended in that flash, all the lives that became shadows, all the futures that were unmade in a single incandescent instant. The ordinary morning, the city that woke not knowing, the 43 seconds that separated before from after, the flash that was coming, the lives that remained, unknowing in their last ordinary moments. We hold them here, in the silence before the light, honoring what was about to be lost, feeling the weight of all that was about to change, standing with them in the final seconds of the world they knew. At 8:16 on August 6th, 1945, time divided. There was before, and there was after, and between them, a flash of light that exceeded any light human beings had ever seen, that burned so bright it cast shadows into stone, that transformed a living city into something else entirely in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The physics unfolded in microseconds. The uranium core of little boy reached critical mass. The chain reaction began, each fission producing neutrons that triggered further fissions, the process multiplying exponentially, the energy building beyond any pace the human mind could follow. Within a millionth of a second, the temperature at the center of the reaction reached millions of degrees. The fireball formed, expanded, reached outward with the fury of a new sun born above the city. The light arrived first, because light travels fastest. Arrived before sound, before blast, before heat became heat, as humans understand heat. The light was everything for an instant. Was the world itself transformed into pure radiance? Was the last thing many saw, printed on their retinas, replacing all other images with white? Those closest to the hypocenter, ground zero, as it would come to be called, did not experience the bomb as a series of events. They experienced nothing. Their bodies were vaporized, transformed from solid matter into expanding gas in fractions of seconds. Where people had stood, shadows remained. The rock and concrete and wood behind them, protected from the initial flash by bodies that were no longer there, leaving human-shaped marks as the only evidence that people had ever existed in those places. The shadows became some of the most haunting images of the atomic age. The silhouette of a person sitting on stone steps, the outline of a man holding a ladder, the negative space where a human being had blocked the light in the instant before ceasing to exist. Those slightly farther away experienced the heat. Temperatures near the hypocenter reached several thousand degrees, enough to ignite clothing and hair, to burn skin from bodies, to set buildings ablaze instantaneously. People walking in the street burst into flames. School children clearing fire breaks became torches. The heat radiated outward at the speed of light, arriving before anyone could react, before any instinct could compel shelter, before the mind could process what was happening. The burns were unlike any burns that medical science had encountered. Deep, extensive, covering entire bodies with wounds that would resist treatment, that would kill many victims in the days and weeks that followed, even when they survived the initial moment. The blast wave came next. The compressed air pushed outward by the expanding fireball, moving at hundreds of miles per hour, carrying with it the force of approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. Buildings collapsed. Windows shattered for miles around. The flying glass becoming secondary projectiles that injured thousands. Bodies were flung like leaves in a hurricane, thrown against walls and rubble, crushed beneath falling structures, buried in debris. The blast flattened everything near the hypocenter, reduced wooden buildings to kindling, damaged concrete structures beyond repair, created a landscape of rubble and ruin that extended in all directions from the point of detonation. Then came the fire. The thermal radiation had ignited countless fires simultaneously across the city. Individual fires merged, fed on the wooden construction that characterized Japanese cities, grew into a firestorm that consumed what the blast had not destroyed. Those trapped in rubble faced death by burning. Those who escaped the immediate blast area found themselves surrounded by fires that blocked escape routes, that consumed oxygen, that turned the city into a crematorium. The firestorm would burn for hours, would consume square miles of urban area, would kill many who had survived the initial explosion and blast. And within all this, radiation, invisible, unfelt in the moment, but present. Gamma rays and neutrons released by the explosion, penetrating bodies, damaging cells, depositing their poison in bone and blood and organ tissue. Those who survived the blast and the fire and the burns would discover in the days and weeks and years that followed that the bomb had left something inside them, something that could not be seen, but that would sicken and kill, that would make hair fall out and gums bleed, that would cause cancers years or decades later, that would mark survivors, the hibakusha, for the remainder of their lives. The death toll defied immediate accounting. Bodies were destroyed beyond recognition, beyond counting. Entire families were erased, leaving no one to report them missing. The estimates converged eventually on a terrible number. Approximately 80,000 dead, immediately or within hours, with tens of thousands more dying in the weeks and months that followed from burns, from radiation sickness, from injuries that could not heal. By year's end, the total would approach 140,000. And this was one weapon, one bomb, dropped by one airplane. The survivors, those who had come to be called Hibakusha, the explosion-affected people, emerged into a world transformed beyond recognition. Streets they had walked that morning no longer existed. Landmarks they had used to navigate had vanished. The people they had known, neighbors, friends, family members, were gone or unrecognizable, burned and bleeding, calling for water, dying in the streets. The survivors walked through what had been their city, through landscapes that resembled nothing. In their experience, searching for people they might never find, for homes that no longer stood, for some stable point of reference in a world that had been entirely unmade. Many walked toward the rivers, drawn by the need for water, by the hope that water might ease their burns, by the simple instinct to move towards something familiar in an unfamiliar world. The rivers filled with the burned and the dying, with people who entered the water and could not emerge, with bodies that floated in currents that had once reflected bridges and willow trees and the ordinary beauty of a city going about its life. The first reports reaching the outside world were confused, contradictory, impossible to credit. A single bomb had destroyed a city. The communications from Hiroshima had simply stopped, as if the city had been erased from existence. Military commanders in Tokyo struggled to understand what had happened, sent reconnaissance aircraft to survey the damage, received reports that could not be believed. And in Washington, Truman received confirmation that the mission had been successful, that the weapon had worked as intended, that a new era in human history had begun in a flash of light over a Japanese city, the light that erased shadows, the fire that consumed a city, the radiation that poisoned the future, the death that came faster than thought. All of it contained in one weapon, in one decision, in one moment that transformed everything that followed. Hiroshima, August 6th, 1945. The city that became a word that meant the end of something and the beginning of something else. The light, the shadows, the silence that followed. 3 days after Hiroshima, while survivors still searched through rubble, while the burned and the dying still filled hospitals without enough medicine or doctors to treat them, while the full scale of what had happened remained unclear even to those who had experienced it, Nagasaki received the second bomb, August 9th, 1945. Fat Man, the implosion device, the plutonium weapon tested at Trinity. 40,000 dead immediately. Tens of thousands more in the aftermath. A second city erased. A second demonstration that this destruction could be repeated, could become routine, could visit any city anywhere until the nation that endured it ceased to resist. On the same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, invading Manchuria with overwhelming force, shattering the last illusion that Japan might negotiate peace through Soviet mediation. The Kwantung Army, once Japan's most powerful military force, collapsed before the Soviet advance. The empire Japan had built over decades disintegrated in days. The war was lost. This was clear to everyone capable of facing facts. The only question remaining was whether Japan's leadership could acknowledge what everyone knew, could bring themselves to accept the unacceptable, could speak the word that had become almost unspeakable in Japanese military culture. Surrender. The Supreme War Council met in Tokyo. The nation's highest military and civilian leaders gathered to decide Japan's fate. The meetings stretched through days and nights, through debates that circled the same impossible terrain. Surrender was unthinkable, but continued resistance meant continued atomic bombing, meant total destruction, meant the end of Japan itself, and the military faction urged continued fighting. One decisive battle that might bloody the invaders enough to win better terms, or failing that, honorable death for the entire nation. The peace faction urged acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration's terms. Surrender, occupation, but survival. The deadlock seemed unbreakable. It was broken by the emperor. Hirohito, the divine sovereign who had by tradition remained above politics, who had allowed the military to wage war in his name without direct intervention, spoke. In a meeting of the Supreme War Council in the early hours of August 10th, he expressed his will that Japan accept the Allied terms. His voice trembled. Tears ran down his face. "I cannot bear to see my innocent people struggle any longer," he said. "The time has come when we must bear the unbearable." The decision did not end the drama. Young officers, refusing to accept surrender, attempted a coup. They seized the imperial palace, searched for the recording of the emperor's surrender announcement, planned to prevent the broadcast that would inform the nation. For hours on the night of August 14th, the fate of the surrender hung in balance, the conspirators searching, loyal officers resisting, the emperor hidden, the recording concealed. By dawn, the coup had failed, its leaders dead by suicide, the surrender proceeding as the emperor had decreed. At noon on August 15th, 1945, Japanese citizens gathered around radios throughout the nation to hear something unprecedented. The voice of the emperor, speaking directly to his subjects for the first time in history, informing them that the war had ended, that Japan had accepted the Allied terms, that they must endure the unendurable and suffer the insufferable. The voice was thin, scratchy through the radio static, speaking in formal court language that many listeners could barely understand. But the meaning was clear enough. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Everything was about to change. The reactions varied. Some wept. Some stood in stunned silence. Some military officers, unable to bear the shame of surrender, committed suicide in front of the imperial palace, in their offices, in formal ceremonies of ritual death. In prison camps across Asia, Allied prisoners of war realized they would live, that the execution orders some had anticipated would not be carried out, that they might see their homes again. In cities across Japan, survivors of years of firebombing and deprivation tried to process what surrender meant. Relief that the bombing would stop, fear of what occupation would bring, grief for all that had been lost, uncertainty about the future. In Washington, Truman announced the surrender to the American people. Crowds gathered in Times Square and in cities across the nation, celebrating the end of a war that had consumed years and hundreds of thousands of American lives. The photographs from that day, the famous image of a sailor kissing a nurse in New York, the throngs of people cheering and embracing, captured genuine relief, genuine joy that the killing had stopped, genuine gratitude that the war had ended before the invasion of Japan became necessary. But beneath the celebration lay complexities that would only become clearer with time. The atomic bombs had introduced something new into human experience. The capacity to destroy cities instantly, to kill hundreds of thousands with single weapons, to hold entire civilizations hostage to the threat of annihilation. The celebration of August 1945 was real, but so was the shadow that fell alongside it. The knowledge that this power existed now, that it could be used again, that humanity had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender while General Douglas MacArthur presided, while American aircraft flew overhead in demonstration of the power that had brought Japan to this moment. The documents were signed. The war was officially over. The occupation of Japan began. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors continued dying from radiation sickness, from burns that would not heal, from injuries sustained in the bombing. The cities began the slow work of clearing rubble, of counting dead, of trying to understand what had happened to them. The hibakusha bore their scars, visible and invisible, into the future, living testimonies to what atomic weapons could do. Voices that would speak across decades about the consequences of the choice that ended the war. The Emperor's voice. The silence that followed. The surrender that ended the fighting but did not end the questions. The celebration that could not erase the shadow. The beginning of the atomic age, announced in a crackling radio broadcast, in a voice speaking of unbearable suffering, in a moment when one war ended and another kind of uncertainty began. August 1945. The end and the beginning. The voice and the silence. Forever marking the threshold between the world before and the world after. For the remaining years of his life, nearly 3 decades after leaving the presidency, Harry Truman maintained with public consistency that the decision to use atomic weapons was the right one. In interviews, in memoirs, in letters, in speeches, he returned to the same arguments. The bombs ended the war quickly, saved lives on both sides, prevented the terrible casualties that invasion would have caused. He expressed no regret, claimed no sleepless nights, presented himself as a man who had made a hard choice and made it well, who had done what the situation required, who had no reason to second-guess what history had already validated. "I never lost any sleep over my decision," he wrote. "I made it, and I would make it again." The words were defiant, perhaps too defiant, as if anticipating criticism that he felt compelled to preempt. The repetition of the defense, the return to the subject again and again over the years, suggested that the decision occupied a larger space in his mind than the claimed ease would suggest. A man who truly felt no doubt might not need to insist so often on his certainty, but the public consistency concealed complexities that emerged in more private moments. In a letter he wrote but never sent, Truman revealed something of the weight he carried. There were moments of unguarded reflection that suggested the decision's burden was heavier than he publicly acknowledged. The presidency itself had been burden enough. The wars and the crises, the decisions and the criticism, the impossibility of leading a superpower through dangerous years without making enemies and mistakes. But the atomic decision was something else, something that stood apart even among the momentous choices of his presidency. Truman left the White House in 1953, returned to Independence, Missouri, to the house he had lived in before the presidency, to the town where he had been a county judge and a local notable before becoming the most powerful man in the world. He walked the streets of Independence in the mornings, visited the barber shop where he had always gotten his hair cut, accepted the modest pension that was all former presidents received in those days, lived simply in the Midwestern manner that had always characterized him. The simplicity was genuine. Truman had entered politics without wealth and left it without wealth, had never enriched himself through public service, had maintained the financial modesty of his haberdashery days throughout his life. The Truman Library rose in Independence, a monument to his presidency, a repository for his papers, a place where visitors could learn about his life and his decisions. Truman involved himself in its creation, donated his papers, participated in its programs, seemed to take satisfaction in the institutional preservation of his legacy. The library would be the place where history would judge him, where scholars would sift through documents and render verdicts, where the choices he had made would be examined and re-examined for generations to come. But what did he think in the quiet hours, in the private moments when the defenses could relax, when the public face did not need to be maintained? The question cannot be answered with certainty. Truman kept his deepest reflections largely to himself, maintained the discipline of a man who understood that presidents could not afford the luxury of publicly expressed doubt, that showing uncertainty about past decisions would only strengthen critics and weaken confidence in the decisions themselves. What we know is that the decision stayed with him, that he continued justifying it, explaining it, defending it long after any political necessity required such defense, that he returned to the subject in conversations with visitors, in responses to letters from the public, in the memoirs he wrote, and the interviews he gave. The repetition suggested the decision's importance to his self-understanding, its centrality to how he made sense of his own life and presidency. He had done many things as president. The Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, the recognition of Israel, the creation of NATO, the decision to fight in Korea. But the atomic bombs were different, were singular, were the decision that history would most remember, that would attach to his name forever. The historical debates continued and continue still. Were the bombs necessary? Would Japan have surrendered without them? Were there alternatives that might have achieved the same result with less loss of life? Did the bomb save lives, or merely demonstrate American power to the Soviets? The questions multiplied with each passing decade, each new revelation from archives, each reassessment by historians with different methods and different assumptions. Truman's certainty has not settled the debates. The arguments continue, as they will continue, because the questions do not admit definitive answers, because counterfactuals cannot be tested, because the decision's rightness or wrongness depends on assumptions that reasonable people will always dispute. What is clear is that Truman bore the weight of being the only person in human history to have authorized nuclear weapons against cities. Whatever he said publicly, whatever ease he claimed, that singular distinction was his and his alone. He made the choice. He gave the order. He received the reports that the mission succeeded. He announced to the world what had been done, and he carried the weight of it through all the years that followed, defended it, explained it, justified it, perhaps to the world, perhaps to history, perhaps to himself. The man who carried the weight, the farmer's son who inherited thunder and used it, the president who faced an impossible choice and made it, who lived with that choice for nearly 30 more years, who maintained his certainty to the end, but returned to the subject again and again, as if still working through its implications, still making peace with what he had done, still carrying the burden that no one else had ever carried or would ever carry in quite the same way. Independence, Missouri. The house on Delaware Street. The morning walks. The letters answered. The visitors received. The library built. The defense maintained. And somewhere beneath all of it, known only to Truman himself. Whatever he truly felt about the choice that defined his legacy, the decision that changed the world, the order that killed 100,000 people in order, he believed, to save more. The weight, the silence, the man who carried them both. In the years following the war, Hiroshima and Nagasaki faced choices that seemed impossible. The rubble remained. The radiation lingered in soil and water, and in the bodies of survivors. The death count continued to rise as injuries proved fatal, and radiation sickness claimed victims months and years after the bombing. The cities had been destroyed more completely than any cities in history, unmade by weapons that had never existed before, reduced to landscapes of ruin that seemed to mock any hope of recovery. But recovery came, slowly, painfully, with the determination of people who refused to let catastrophe become ending. The rubble was cleared. New buildings rose. Streets were rebuilt. Streetcars resumed their routes through neighborhoods that had been erased and now existed again in different form. The cities chose to live, chose to rebuild, chose to transform themselves from sites of destruction into something else. Testimonies not just to what had been lost, but to what could be created in the aftermath of loss. Hiroshima made a particular choice: to become a city of peace. The Peace Memorial Park was created at the Hypo Center, where the bomb had detonated, where the destruction had been most complete. The Atomic Bomb Dome, the former Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, whose distinctive shell had survived the blast, was preserved as a monument, left in its ruined state as permanent reminder of what had happened. The Peace Memorial Museum was built to tell the story, to display artifacts from the bombing, to ensure that future generations would know what atomic weapons could do. The Hibakusha, the survivors, became witnesses. They told their stories to anyone who would listen, traveled to other countries to share what they had experienced, worked to ensure that the world would remember. Their testimony was difficult to give and difficult to receive. The details of radiation sickness, of burns that scarred for life, of family members lost, of futures unmade. But they persisted in telling, believing that their suffering would have meaning only if it prevented others from suffering the same fate. If the world learned from Hiroshima and Nagasaki that nuclear weapons must never be used again, the annual Peace Memorial Ceremony in Hiroshima became a ritual of remembrance and commitment. Each August 6th at 8:15 in the morning, the exact moment of the bombing, bells toll throughout the city, and a moment of silence is observed. The mayor of Hiroshima reads a peace declaration, calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons. Paper lanterns are floated on the rivers in the evening, each carrying a message for the dead. The lights drifting downstream like the souls of those who died, like prayers released into the darkness. Nagasaki developed its own culture of memory, its own peace park and museum, its own annual ceremonies. The city had been bombed almost accidentally. It was the secondary target that day, chosen when clouds obscured the primary target of Kokura. The randomness of that fact haunted the city's memory. If the weather had been different, Nagasaki would have been spared. Some other city would have received the bomb. The arbitrary quality of destruction was part of what Nagasaki remembered and memorialized. The survivors aged. Many died young from cancers and other diseases linked to radiation exposure. Those who lived carried their experience into old age. Watching as younger generations grew up without direct memory of the bombing, watching as the world they had tried to warn seemed sometimes to forget the urgency of their message. The Hibakusha worried that when the last of them died, the living memory would die with them, that the bombing would become merely history rather than warning, that the world would lose the human testimony that made the statistics meaningful. But they also found reason for hope. The decades passed, and no nuclear weapon was used in war. The threshold established at Nagasaki held. The taboo that formed around nuclear weapons, the sense that they were different from other weapons, that using them would cross a line that must never be crossed, became one of the strongest norms in international relations. The survivors' testimony contributed to that taboo, made the abstract concrete, gave faces and stories to the statistics, ensured that those who contemplated nuclear use would have to confront what it actually meant. The cities that rose from ash became more than cities, became symbols, became pilgrimages sites where people from around the world came to learn and to mourn and to commit themselves to preventing repetition, became permanent reminders that nuclear weapons were not abstractions, but realities, that their use had consequences measured in human suffering, that the choice to use them or not to use them was the most consequential choice humanity faced. The peace flame burns in Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park, a flame lit in 1964 that will not be extinguished until all nuclear weapons are eliminated from the earth. The flame still burns, still waits, still marks the distance between the world as it is and the world as the Hibakusha hoped it would become. Decades have passed. Nuclear weapons remain. The flame continues burning. Patient, persistent. Testimony to hope that has not been fulfilled, but has not been abandoned either. The cities that rose from ash, the survivors who bore witness, the memorials that preserve memory, the flame that still burns, waiting for a world that has not yet arrived. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forever marked by what happened in August 1945, forever committed to ensuring it never happens again. The rising, the remembering, the waiting, the hope that persists despite everything that argues against hope. The bombs that fell on Japan did not end with Japan. Within 4 years, the Soviet Union tested its own nuclear device, breaking the American monopoly, initiating the arms race that would define the Cold War. Within a decade, Britain and France had joined the nuclear club. Within 2 decades, China had tested its first weapon. The proliferation continued. India, Pakistan, Israel, though never officially acknowledged, North Korea. The shadow that fell on Hiroshima spread across the globe, covering every nation, threatening every city, transforming international politics into something unprecedented in human history. The arsenals grew beyond any rational purpose. The United States built tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union built tens of thousands more. The weapons grew more powerful. Hydrogen bombs that dwarfed the weapons used against Japan. Single warheads that could destroy entire metropolitan areas. Missiles that could deliver their payloads across continents in 30 minutes. The logic of deterrence required each side to maintain the capacity to destroy the other even after absorbing a first strike, required redundancy and survivability, required enough weapons to end civilization several times over. The policy was called Mutual Assured Destruction, MAD with its too apt acronym, and it worked, in the sense that it prevented direct superpower conflict, prevented the nuclear war that both sides feared. But it worked through terror, through the constant threat of annihilation, through the knowledge that any crisis might spiral into extinction, that the leaders of nuclear states held their fingers near buttons that could end everything. The generations who grew up during the Cold War lived with this knowledge, absorbed it into their consciousness, learned to accept as normal what would have seemed insane to any previous generation, that humanity possessed the means to destroy itself and kept those means ready for use at all times. The close calls accumulated. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the United States and Soviet Union came closer to nuclear war than they had ever come before or have ever come since. When the fate of civilization rested on decisions made by a few leaders in a few days. When luck and wisdom combined to pull the world back from the edge at the last moment. The false alarms when warning systems malfunctioned. When radar signatures were misinterpreted. When the fate of hundreds of millions rested on the judgment of officers who had minutes to decide whether the incoming attack was real or error. The accidents that nearly triggered catastrophe. Broken arrows, as the military called them. Planes carrying nuclear weapons that crashed. Missiles that malfunctioned. Submarines that came to the brink of launching. The stories of those who said no became some of the most important stories of the era. Vasily Arkhipov, the Soviet submarine officer who refused to authorize a nuclear torpedo launch during the Cuban Missile Crisis, whose dissent prevented what might have been the first shot of a nuclear war. Stanislav Petrov, the Soviet officer who judged a warning of incoming American missiles to be a false alarm, who chose not to report it as an attack, whose judgment proved correct and may have prevented a retaliatory launch based on error. The individuals whose choices, often unknown at the time, stood between the world and its end. The arms control efforts attempted to manage what could not be eliminated. The Limited Test Ban Treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the SALT and START agreements, the INF Treaty, each represented an attempt to constrain the arsenals, to prevent further proliferation, to establish rules for a situation that had no precedent in human history. The treaties helped. They did not solve the fundamental problem, that the weapons existed, that they remained ready for use, that the knowledge of how to build them could not be unlearned. The end of the Cold War brought hope that the nuclear threat might recede. The Soviet Union collapsed. Russia and the United States negotiated further reductions. The world breathed easier, believing perhaps that the danger had passed, that the terrible decades were behind us, that nuclear weapons would fade into historical curiosity as the tensions that had justified them relaxed. But the danger did not end. The weapons remained, fewer than at the Cold War's peak, but still enough to destroy civilization many times over. New nuclear states emerged. The risk of nuclear terrorism, of weapons or materials falling into the hands of non-state actors, became a new fear. The relationships between nuclear powers grew more complicated, more multipolar, less stable in some ways than the Cold War's terrible but predictable standoff. The shadow that spread across the world remains, still covers every city, still threatens every nation, still poses the ultimate question about human civilization survival. The decision that Truman made in the summer of 1945 set in motion a chain of consequences that continues still, that will continue until nuclear weapons are abolished or until they are used again, that holds humanity in a grip that has loosened but has not released. The shadow, the arsenals, the close calls, the continuing danger, all of it flowing from the summer when the first bombs fell, when the power of stars was brought to Earth, when humanity discovered it could destroy itself and chose not to destroy itself, but also chose not to give up the power to do so. The world that Hiroshima made, the shadow that has not lifted, the question that remains unanswered. Since Nagasaki, no nuclear weapon has been used in war, 78 years and counting. The longest pause between the invention of a major weapon system and its use in combat in the history of modern warfare. The threshold established in August 1945 has held. Something has prevented the crossing. Whether wisdom or luck or fear, whether careful policy or fortunate accident, the world has managed to live with nuclear weapons without using them again. This is not nothing. It is perhaps the most important fact about the nuclear age, that the worst has not happened, that the weapon built to destroy cities have not destroyed cities since Nagasaki, that the arsenals assembled to end civilization have not ended civilization, that each day since August 9th, 1945, has been a day when humanity chose, consciously or unconsciously, deliberately or fortunately, not to cross the threshold again. The restraint has many sources. The policy of deterrence, whatever its costs and risks, created mutual fear that helped prevent use. The memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, kept alive by survivors and memorials and education, reminded leaders of what nuclear weapons actually did, made the abstract concrete, made use seem monstrous rather than merely strategic. The taboo that formed around nuclear weapons, the sense that they were fundamentally different from other weapons, that using them would violate something essential about human civilization, created normative constraints that complemented strategic ones. But the restraint has also been lucky. The close calls could have gone differently. The false alarms could have been believed. The accidents could have triggered escalation. The crises could have spiraled. The individuals who chose caution could have chosen differently. The history of the nuclear age includes many moments when the threshold was approached, when one decision or one malfunction could have meant crossing. That we did not cross was not inevitable, was not guaranteed by any force of nature or law of history, was the result of choices made by fallible humans in moments of extreme pressure, choices that could have been made differently. The threshold remains. Nuclear weapons remain. The thousands of warheads that exist today could still destroy civilization if they were used. The danger has not ended. It has only been managed, contained, prevented from becoming actuality. So far, the task of maintaining the threshold continues, requires constant attention, cannot be completed once and then forgotten. Each generation inherits the weapons and the responsibility. Each generation must choose whether to maintain the restraint or to abandon it. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki hoped that their testimony would help maintain the threshold, that the world would learn from their suffering and choose never to repeat it. Their hope has been partially fulfilled. The threshold has held, but the lesson has not been fully learned. Nuclear weapons have not been abolished. The threat remains. The suffering of the Hibakusha has served as warning, but the warning has been heeded only incompletely, only provisionally, only for now. What would it mean to fully honor their testimony? It would mean working toward a world without nuclear weapons, toward the elimination of the threat rather than merely its management. This was the vision of many who survived the bombing. who dedicated their lives to abolition, who believed that as long as nuclear weapons existed, they would eventually be used. The vision has not been achieved. The obstacles, political, strategic, technical, remain formidable. But the vision persists, carried forward by new generations who inherit both the weapons and the hope that the weapons might someday be eliminated. The threshold we have not crossed, the restraint we have maintained, the luck that has held, the hope that remains, all of it part of the legacy of August 1945, part of what flows from the decision that Truman made, part of the ongoing story of humanity living with the power to destroy itself and choosing so far not to exercise that power. The threshold, the hope, the continuing responsibility, the story that is not yet over, that will not be over until the weapons are gone or until they are used. The waiting, the vigilance, the choice that must be made again and again in each crisis, in each moment when the threshold beckons, in each generation that inherits what the previous generation preserved. Was Truman's decision right? The question has been asked countless times by historians and philosophers, by military strategists and peace activists, by those who lived through the event and those who inherited its consequences. The answers vary. The certainty that Truman expressed is not shared by all who have examined the evidence, who have considered the alternatives, who have weighed the costs against what was achieved. Some defend the decision completely. They point to the projected casualties of invasion, to the ferocity of Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, to the military culture that made surrender almost unthinkable, to the lives saved on both sides by ending the war quickly. They argue that the bombs were the least terrible option available, that other paths to victory would have cost more lives, that Truman made the right choice given what he knew and what he faced. Others condemn it completely. They point to evidence that Japan was seeking peace before the bombs fell, that the naval blockade and conventional bombing had already made defeat inevitable, that the bombs were used primarily to demonstrate American power to the Soviet Union rather than to compel Japanese surrender, that the targeting of civilians violated moral principles that no strategic calculation could justify. Most historians occupy positions between these poles. They acknowledge the complexity, the uncertainty, the impossibility of knowing what would have happened had different choices been made. They recognize that the decision was made by real human beings facing real pressures, with incomplete information and limited time, in a world exhausted by years of total war. They neither condemn absolutely nor absolve completely, but sit with the difficulty, acknowledging both what the decision achieved and what it cost. The counterfactuals multiply endlessly. What if the bomb had been demonstrated rather than used against cities? What if the surrender terms had been modified earlier to guarantee the emperor's position? What if the Soviet entry into the war, rather than the bombs, had been the decisive factor? What if Japan had surrendered before the bombs fell? Or what if they had not surrendered after? What if the invasion had proceeded and the casualties had been even worse than projected, or far less? Each counterfactual leads to others, branching possibilities that can never be resolved because they can never be tested. What we know is what happened. The bombs fell. The cities were destroyed. The war ended. The nuclear age began. The consequences continue to unfold. Whatever might have been, what was, is what we have to work with, what we have to understand, what we have to carry forward into whatever future awaits. The questions persist because they matter. The decision to use atomic weapons against cities established precedents, created possibilities, shaped the world we inhabit. Understanding that decision, as fully and honestly as we can, is not merely academic exercise, but essential preparation for the decisions that may yet face us or our descendants. The questions we ask about Truman's choice are ultimately questions about ourselves. What we would do, what we should do, what we can live with having done. And perhaps the most important lesson is humility. Humility before the complexity of history, which resists simple judgments and easy conclusions. Humility before the suffering of those who died, whose lives were not abstractions but realities, whose deaths were not statistics but endings of worlds entire unto themselves. Humility before the survivors, whose testimony reminds us what nuclear weapons actually mean, what they actually do, what it actually means to experience their use. Humility before the questions that exceed our capacity to answer, that will be debated as long as nuclear weapons exist, that require us to think carefully about power and responsibility and the limits of human wisdom. The story of Truman's decision is not finished. It continues in every nuclear crisis, every arms control negotiation, every moment when leaders must decide whether to maintain or abandon the threshold. It continues in the memorials at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the testimony of the Hibakusha, in the education of new generations who must learn what happened and why it matters. It continues in the questions we ask and the answers we struggle to find, in the arguments we have and the uncertainties we must accept. The summer of 1945, the decision, the consequences, the questions that have no ending, all of it part of the human story now, part of what we carry, part of what we must understand if we are to navigate the world that decision created, the bombs that fell, the lives that ended, the world that began, the questions that remain, forever asking, forever demanding our attention, forever part of what it means to be human in the nuclear age. Conclusion. The weight we carry forward. The night deepens. The story draws toward close. But there is no true ending. No final word that settles the questions. No conclusion that relieves us of responsibility. The story of Harry Truman and the decision to drop the atomic bomb is not history that stays safely in the past. It is living history, present history, history that shapes the world we inhabit and the choices we face. We have walked through that summer of 1945, have felt something of its weight, have stood with Truman as he received the news of the weapon's power, as he gave the order for its use, as he received reports of what it accomplished, have descended into the secret cities where the weapon was forged, have witnessed the flash that turned sand to glass, have moved through the last ordinary morning of a city that did not know what was coming, have sat with the survivors, have honored their testimony, have contemplated the cities that rose from ash, have traced the shadow that spread across the world, have counted the close calls, have stood at the threshold that has not been crossed. What do we carry forward from this journey? Not certainty. The questions remain questions. The debates continue. The rightness or wrongness of the decision cannot be settled by any evidence we possess. What we carry is awareness. Awareness of what nuclear weapons are, what they do, what it means to live in a world where they exist. Awareness of the human dimensions of strategic decisions, the lives behind the statistics, the suffering that abstractions can conceal. Awareness of our responsibility, inherited, unavoidable, continuing. To think carefully about these weapons, to maintain the threshold, to work toward a world where the threat is finally ended. Truman has been gone for more than 50 years. The hibakusha grow fewer each year, their ranks thinning as time claims those who survived the bombing. The world has changed in ways that 1945 could not have imagined. New technologies, new powers, new challenges. But the nuclear question remains, as urgent now as it was when the first mushroom cloud rose over New Mexico, as consequential now as when Truman gave the order that destroyed Hiroshima. We are all inheritors of that decision, all citizens of the nuclear age, all responsible in whatever small way for what happens next. The choice that Truman faced, impossible, terrible, consequential beyond measure, is not our choice, but the consequences of his choice are ours to live with, ours to manage, ours to resolve if resolution is possible. The threshold he crossed established the possibility of crossing. The threshold that has held since Nagasaki requires our vigilance to maintain. The night settles around us. The story rests. Let sleep come, carrying with it whatever dreams may come. Dreams perhaps of a world without nuclear weapons, of the flame at Hiroshima, finally extinguished because its work is done, of the questions finally answered, of the weight finally lifted. Dreams of peace that is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of security, of a world where cities need not fear the flash, where children need not learn about mushroom clouds, where the terrible inheritance of August 1945 is finally, fully resolved. Until then, we carry the weight, carry the questions, carry the responsibility, carry the hope that persists despite everything that argues against hope. The decision, the consequences, the questions, the weight. Sleep now, and wake remembering that the story continues, that we are part of it, that what we do matters, that the threshold must be maintained, that the hope must be preserved. The summer of 1945, the decision that changed everything, the world that followed, the questions that remain, forever asking, forever ours to answer. Good night.